We are rolling. It is my great privilege and pleasure to welcome today Jesse Holland and Abigail DeVille for a conversation between the two of them about both of your work, which has some interesting intersections and overlaps, I think, in intriguing ways. So I will start by way of introducing myself. My name is Anne Reeve. I'm an associate curator at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C., and have worked with Abigail on one project in particular, her sculpture Light of Freedom, which has been in our sculpture garden since October of last year. And I will offer some brief bios of our illustrious speakers today, starting with Jesse Holland, who is an award-winning writer, journalist, and television personality. He hosts the Sunday edition of C-SPAN's Washington Journal and is an opinion columnist for MSNBC.com. He has been a longtime race and ethnicity writer for the AP, the Associated Press, as well as serving the White House as a White House Supreme Court and congressional reporter. During his 2 decades in the nation's capital, he was one of the few reporters to be a credentialed member of all 3 members of the major Washington press corps. Quite a coup. He is currently serving as an assistant professor at the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University, where he teaches beginning news writing, advanced news writing, and culture reporting. He's the author and editor of the award-winning Black Panther, Tales of Wakanda prose anthology, and the author of the Black Panther, Who is the Black Panther prose novel, as well as the Star Wars The Force Awakens Finn Story Jr. novel. He also wrote the Superman red and blue comic book story Deadline and the Represent issue Heritage for DC Comics. He is a noted nonfiction author, and we'll focus, I think, especially on that work today, with 2 African-American history books currently on shelves: The Invisibles, the untold story of African-American slaves in the White House, and Black Men Built the Capitol, African-American history in and around Washington, D.C. So beautiful the way that your work is sort of anchored in history, but traffics across fiction and nonfiction, creative and maybe historical disciplines. So I think there is some overlap, especially with Abigail DeVille, whose work is also often across disciplines and mines the overlooked and often traumatic histories of Black and Brown Americans in order to spotlight cultural contradictions and inequities and ask questions about how we experience and understand the world through our shared narrative histories. Abigail was born in New York. She received her MFA from Yale University in 2011 and her BFA from the New York Fashion Institute of Technology in 2007. More recent exhibitions of her work include the newly opened Cleveland Triennial, brand new heavies at Pioneer Works New York in 2021, and the American Future also in 2021 at the Portland Institute of Contemporary Art. Her work has been exhibited widely in the US at the Whitney, at the ICA in Los Angeles, at the Studio Museum in Harlem, at the New Museum in New York, and also internationally at the Punta della Dogana in Venice, Italy, the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam as 2 examples. She has also designed sets for theatrical productions at venues such as the Stratford Festival, Harlem Stage, La Mama, and Joe's Pub. She has received the Award of Honors Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, Creative Capital grantee. She has received an Obie Award for design. She has taught at the Maryland Institute College of Art and has been a critic at the Yale School of Art. Together, I am almost out of breath outlining your collective many accomplishments. Bravo to you both. So just to offer a little bit of context for today's conversation, I wanted to speak briefly about Abigail's sculpture, Light of Freedom, and maybe we can pull up an image of that work. So we worked with Abigail to stage an installation of this in our garden in October of 2021. And as a very sort of bare bones outline, this is a work that stands about 13 feet tall and consists of a framework of gold painted scaffolding. And from that is suspended an armature, kind of lilting in the shape of the Statue of Liberty's torch. A tangle of painted blue mannequin limbs is clustered and emerges from the top of this armature as the torch is flame. And there is a silenced found school bell nestled within the center of the torch's handle towards the base. This was a work that was commissioned in the summer of 2020 by Madison Square Park Conservancy in New York. And it was commissioned in response to and really in the direct aftermath of George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis. The work went on view in New York in October of 2020, then traveled to the Momentary in Bentonville, Arkansas, and again, came to us on the National Mall in the fall of 2021. To mark its arrival, Abigail conceptualized an entirely new performance that was titled Wake Up, Liberation Call at Dawn. Did in fact take place at sunrise on the National Mall on October, I believe, 15th of 2021. It was a really moving collaboration between Abigail, New York-based performers, and performers local to the DC area as well. So both Abigail and Jessie are clearly creative thinkers who work across disciplines, those who investigate history as a tool through which we can better approach and understand not only our past, but also our contemporary world. And as Abigail is in the process of conceptualizing another new performance in relation to the National Mall, and Jessie's book, The Invisibles, has become something of a touchstone for, I know, Abigail, you're thinking on this project. We wanted to bring the two of you together today to chat. So I'll start us off just initially, and then let the two of you take us where you will. But Abigail, how did you first come to Jessie's book? How did it first sort of come across your field of vision and begin your thinking about this performance?
I feel like somebody told me about this book around 2016 when I did a project at the Peel Center with the Contemporary in Baltimore. So I made a site-specific response that was multiple installations, and the building that is considered to be the first building constructed to be a museum here in the United States. I think the building was built in 1814, but I don't know how that happened. Anyway, but so thinking about the potential for doing a kind of closing performance with the Hirshhorn, and thinking about the site of the National Mall and the fact that there were slave markets on the mall, and thinking about how it has been a continual stage that kind of inhabits all of the contradictions and the freedom struggles layered within like the strata of this idea of American democracy, right? So thinking about the specifics of the site, and that the White House is like a stone's throw away from there. So I really wanted to talk about the kind of as in your title, right, calling it the invisibles, right? The invisible labor that has continued to uphold this nation's values, whether it does or not, right? Like that people believe in it more fervently than maybe the founding fathers did. And I think you touched in the book a lot about the kinds of parallel freedom struggles that were happening in the midst of the creation of this new nation, right? Like that there was always the fight for liberty from compromised labor is what I'll say, Anyway, yeah, so I guess to start out, I kind of wanted to know how you came to the title, The Invisibles, and how you conceived of going down the road for this book.
Well, first of all, thank you for all of your work, because this is incredible. And this is an area that I've cared about for such a long time. And to see artists like yourself taking this kind of work and taking it in even another direction is just fabulous. I've been interested in African-American history my entire life. I'm actually from Mississippi, from a small town called Holly Springs. And I grew up in the house with two public school teachers. Both my dad and my mom taught in public school. In fact, my mother was my 7th and 8th grade English teacher. I went to one of those small 1 through 12 schools. But one of the things that my parents did for me was they made sure that I had a passing, if not deep knowledge of African-American history. because if you don't know your history, you end up accepting what other people tell you who you are. So they made sure that I knew that our history in Mississippi, where our family came from, and all of that. And when I left Mississippi and moved to South Carolina, then to New York, and then here to Washington. Everywhere I go, I try to find out the African-American history of that place. So when I ended up here in Washington in 2000, I began asking about the African-American history of Washington, D.C. And people could tell you some great things about D.C. They could talk all day long about U Street. They could talk all day long about Anacostia. They could talk all day long about Georgetown. But the place where people go to in Washington is a national mall. They take extra effort to go to Anacostia and to Georgetown and to U Street. But the first place everyone goes is a national mall. But no one ever talked about the African-American history that was sitting there on the mall. So I decided that, hey, if nobody else is going to talk about it, I'm going to talk about it. In fact, I'm going to write it so we never lose it. Because a lot of our history is an oral history. People can tell you anything, but to make sure it's safe, you have to write it down. So I took it upon myself to start collecting these stories about Washington, D.C. And it actually first came out in a book called Black Men Built the Capitol, Discovering African-American History in and around Washington, D.C. And in that book, I touched a little bit on the White House. But there's so much African-American history in Washington, D.C., I wasn't able to do justice to the stories that were available about the White House. So I made The Invisibles my next project, and it took me about 7 years to collect these stories and to verify them. I'm not writing rumors. I'm a nonfiction reporter. Everything I wrote in The Invisibles, I have documents that I can prove that it was true. But when I started working on The Invisibles, and it actually started in a writing residency that I still participate in these days at Goucher College in Towson, it started at a writing residency. And we were talking about, I remember talking about what was the purpose of this book. And the purpose of the book is not to replace American history, to correct it, to tell the invisible side of the story of America. Many times when we talk about the United States, we want to talk about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, but George Washington wouldn't have been able to do what he did without the slaves that made his living at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson would not have been able to sit around and think up all of these great thoughts of democracy if he hadn't been profiting from the labor of the African-American enslaved at Monticello. And the same with James Madison. This doesn't replace those stories of those thinkers, but it tells how they did it. It tells the invisible side of African-American history here in the United States. And so that's where I got the title, The Invisibles. The story has always been there. We've just never acknowledged it. And that's what I tried to do with this book, acknowledge the untold story of the people who made the White House work and allowed the presidents to do the things that they did.
I think that's the thing. I was telling Anne at some point that the first story in the book where you talk about Billy Lee, like that, the closeness of their relationship and how, like, painting a full picture of the complicated nature of human relationships and living in such close proximity and someone really being dependent, like almost debilitatingly dependent on this person. Like it's more than just like a laborer or something, you know, like I don't know. There's something in that I don't know if I even still have like the words for that. Felt so complicating, like soul crushing, the way that it's drawn out, and thinking about how this person could have marched into battle or just been riding on a horse in the middle of an armed conflict without a weapon because it was against the law, or thinking about how George Washington was so dependent upon him that even when he wasn't physically able to, still like move and get around, like he still, requested him to be in places. Or that was the thing. That's the thing that killed me. Now I remember now. It was the way he received the guests of the veterans of the Revolutionary War to George Washington's funeral. That was the thing that like kind of like did me in terms of like thinking about that. This person too is a founding father, right? Like this person too is a Revolutionary War hero. This person too was there on the battleground and in these sites. And so I don't know, I think you made it like crystal clear of how you can't like thinking about passing the baton in a race, right? Like, but that the baton is being passed, but it's like, okay, George Washington is the front runner, but he was passing the baton to Billy Lee. Anyway, I don't know. There's not really a question in there, but I don't know if you have anything to say about.
Right. I'll just add in for those of you who might not know who Billy Lee is. William Lee was George Washington's quote unquote butler. We're going to call him his butler, but he was his slave. But in his time, William Billy Lee was the most famous African in the United States, because everywhere George Washington went, he took Billy Lee with him. Billy Lee was in the boat with George Washington when they crossed the Delaware. Billy Lee was in New York when George Washington becomes president. Everywhere George Washington went, Billy Lee went. In fact, as Abigail was saying, when George Washington went into battle, he took Billy Lee along with him. Now, George Washington was known as one of the best horsemen in the United States at the then pre-United States. There was only one person who was as good or better, and that was Billy Lee. Because George Washington, if he needed another horse in battle, it was Billy's job to get the horse to George Washington. And as Abigail said, Billy never had any weapons because, of course, Billy was enslaved, and they give Billy a gun, Billy might be gone. Billy might take his gun and move on. So Billy had to do all of this. He rode through all of those battles with George Washington, survived without any weapons, even going through several major injuries. So while we do talk about George Washington and all of the things he did, we have to acknowledge that a lot of that would not have happened without Billy Lee being there to take care of him. But we know who George Washington is. Many people have no idea who Billy Lee is, but we should honor people like Billy Lee, because we wouldn't know a country the way we do now if not for George Washington. But George Washington wouldn't have been there if not for Billy Lee. And as Abigail said, even after George Washington dies, people who knew would come and talk to Billy Lee. He would go and talk to them. They knew, the people who were there knew Billy Lee's contribution. They knew who he was and what his skills were. But even today, very few people know who Billy Lee is. It's one of those invisible stories that doesn't change the story of George Washington. It just lets you know so much more about it and lets you know how George Washington got to where he is. These are the type of stories that we need to amplify. It doesn't change American history, but it informs us more about it. And that's what we need to do, because it actually gives us as African Americans a greater piece of this country, knowing that it wouldn't be here without the labors and the courage of our ancestors.
I'm thinking now about, I don't want to butcher her name. Actually, Oni, is her name Oni?
Oni Judge. Yep.
Oni Judge, yeah.
Yep.
I'm like, that's what it spelled like. I don't know if that's how you say it, but the fact that she supposedly had this like kind of cushy job or position in the house, right, as this person who was especially like called out and to be almost like a lady in waiting to Martha Washington. And so how could you ever, like your fate could have been so much dire. Like, why would you ever want to leave that? And then thinking about what she said in terms of how she was, interviewed later in her life, if she regretted, running away, right? Like that, but she wasn't going to be freed, right? I don't want to butcher the story, so I'll let you tell it. But like, yeah, like that wasn't the point. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, the tale of Oni Judge turns on its head the theory that any slave was happy to be there, that they were satisfied with their life. Now, Oni Judge's job was to be, once again, I'll say politely, a lady in waiting for Martha Washington, meaning that she was her maid. Her job was to make sure Martha Washington's life was as easy as possible. And just like Billy Lee, everywhere Martha Washington went, she took Oni Judge with her. When the Washingtons were in Philadelphia, wrapping up their term as president, Oni Judge was in Philadelphia with them. Now, understand that the Washingtons owned a plantation, and they grew tobacco and other crops. So there were slaves that they owned who worked out in the Virginia sun. And just like this summer, it's 100-something plus degrees in the summertime in the Washington area. So Oni Judge's life, comparatively speaking to other slaves at Mount Vernon, wasn't that difficult. She had freedom to go out and come back if she wanted. She could make a little extra money on the side. They made sure she had nice clothes. Once again, relatively speaking, for an enslaved human being, they made sure she had nice clothing, and she was able to socialize with people in a way that field slaves were not. So someone could argue that given that she was a slave, Oni Judge should have been satisfied with her life. She wasn't treated as poorly as other slaves were. But once again, Oni Judge is a slave, and she is the property of Martha Washington. So while the Washingtons were in Pennsylvania wrapping up their term, Pennsylvania actually was a free state, and the Washingtons lived in Virginia, which was a slave state. So the Washingtons were under the rule of Pennsylvania, which was if slaves cross into Pennsylvania, 6 months after they cross into Pennsylvania, the slave is automatically free. The Washingtons knew this. So every 5 months and 2 weeks, they would take all of their slaves back from Pennsylvania to Virginia, and then bring them back to Pennsylvania to start the 6-month clock over again. Well, as they get close to moving back to Mount Vernon permanently, Oni Judge realized that if she set foot in Virginia again, she would be a slave her entire life. Also, Martha Washington, since she was the owner of Oni Judge, had started making noises about giving Oni Judge as a wedding gift to some friends of hers. Now imagine someone just giving your person as a gift to someone. So Oni Judge decides that, you know what, maybe I don't want to be a slave the rest of my life. Maybe I don't want to be a wedding gift. So one evening, as she's serving the Washingtons their dinner in Philadelphia, she goes into the kitchen, walks out the back door, and just keeps going. And she ends up in Rhode Island. And despite his reputation as the first president of the United States, George Washington basically spent the rest of his life trying to hunt Oni Judge down and force her, not just her, but any children she had, to come back to Mount Vernon so they could be enslaved again. But in an interview at the end of her life, Oni Judge was asked about whether she had any regrets for running away from George Washington. And she said, no, because I'm free. Even to the end of her life, she appreciated the fact that she was free. And once again, this is one of those stories that once it doesn't change anything George Washington did, but it tells us a lot more about George Washington, the human being, and not just George Washington, but Martha Washington as well. We get to learn a lot more and appreciate a lot more about what life was like for African Americans in the United States and what some of the stories that we know about this country were based on. And it's one of those incredible things that I just love bringing out in the book, being in books like this and having amplified through art.
Yeah, because it wasn't about the creature comforts or the fact that she had a kind of relatively cushy life, or that she had her own room or some, fly clothes that she could wear, some nonsense, And when somebody recognized her in the street, because they were searching for her for what, years?
For years.
For years, and it was like a friend of the family who recognized her and then was like wondering if Martha must be nearby, and she told her that she'd run away, and she said, well, why? Like, how could she ever do without you? It's like such nonsense. And then, she said, I wanted to learn how to read. I wanted to learn how to write. And then, whatever. But like thinking about the kinds of freedoms that we take for granted, right? Like to just, exist, be in a space and a time and a place where you want to be, that's dictated completely by you and not somebody else and controlling what you can do. I think. And then the bargaining that happened with like a nephew, I think you wrote about also, like Washington sent a nephew up there to try to bring her back, and he had tried to like reason with her, and then was decided that he was going to kidnap her.
Right.
It's totally ridiculous.
This tells us so much more about George Washington, that he was willing to negotiate, but if that failed, we're just going to kidnap her and bring her back home. And literally the only reason why they didn't do that is because there were abolitionists in that same town where she lived, and they were able to get her away before Washington's relatives could kidnap her and bring her back to Virginia. So, I mean, once again, these stories tell us a lot more about the personalities of these American founding fathers, which a lot of times we deify and turn into these mythological figures who could do no wrong. Well, they were human beings too, and these stories help us identify their human foibles, their human faults in these people, and they also tell us more about the people who made the founding fathers who they were at their time. George Washington would not have been able to run a household without the efforts of people like Billy Lee, like Hercules, like Oney Judge. They gave George Washington the time to do all the other things that we give him credit for. But once again, he wouldn't have been able to do that without the work of these African-American enslaved people that he had at Mount Vernon, and he dragged around with him all over the country while he was commanding the Continental Forces and being the first president.
And this is like totally off topic, but I wonder what do you think of West Ford?
You have hit one of the topics that if I had unlimited time and money, I would be working on right now. Because if George Washington had any descendants, direct descendants, West Ford likely would be one of them. But it's one of those topics that you would need to do so much DNA work. You'd have to find people willing to allow you to use their DNA to do this work. Right now, it's just that's one reason why you don't see West Ford in a lot of the Invisibles, is because while the family story is that he is a direct descendant of George Washington, nothing has ever been proven. So we still talk about Gum Springs. Those of us who live here, we know about West Ford, but it's never been really proven that he is a descendant of George Washington, even though most of us believe it.
Yeah, those pictures, when that picture, there was an article that came out, I think, in the New Yorker earlier this year. When I saw that picture, I was dying. Like I fell out of my chair because it
You know,
looks
it's
so
like
much like
it's one of those things where you look
ridiculous.
at a baby and you can see the eyes of the father and mother. You look at Wes Ford, it's hard to argue he's not a Washington.
It's insane. It's utterly insane. But I just wanted to throw that at you. I know
That's one of the things that we were talking about earlier, that so many of this is an oral tradition. But the only problem with oral traditions is that storytellers die.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes these stories get lost and they become rumor and legend and myth. The great thing about writing a book or doing a piece of art is that then the history becomes permanent.
Mm-hmm.
And it's available for anyone who wants to learn it, anyone who wants to appreciate it. That's what makes the work that you do and the work that I do, I hope the work that I do, so impactful, because now these stories will never be lost again. And that those who come behind us will always be able, if they want to, learn these stories and appreciate it in the way I hope you and I do.
So, I mean, I just tell you a little bit about what I'm thinking about that was like spurred on by your book. But so the performance that I hope that we are able to do in November is actually trying to figure out who all the names of all the people who were enslaved by the different presidents as the staff of the White House, and have their names read at a microphone, and there be a kind of procession and maybe some sort of light sculpture and live music, which at the moment is Michelle Deguicello, but we'll see what happens. But anyway, but yeah, so I think it's like really important, and I think the work that you do is vital in terms of like bringing back like these one voices like that Oni was, quoted in your book in her own words about, her thoughts on her liberty or her liberation, and taking it for herself and not letting it be, like waiting and until it was given and upon, Washington's death or whatever. But that wasn't even going to happen for her anyway, because she was going to be gifted to a relative as a wedding gift, and so there was going to be no opportunity for her liberation. But anyway, just like speaking the past into the present in order in the ways that you're talking about, in order that the names don't die or the stories don't die, right? Just how powerful it is to like bring back, like pulling back like these words, texts, names, almost like prayers that are recited, right? And bringing them into the present moment in ways that validate our current existence, but validate their contributions as founding Americans, right?
I mean, and that's so true. I think we don't give enough credit to the people who got us to where we are today. And we tend to look at the quote unquote top level. We tend to look at the Washingtons and the Jeffersons. But I guarantee you, George Washington never nailed a single nail at the White House. Neither Thomas Jefferson never lifted a single board to make the White House what it is today. He may have had the thoughts, but the actual things that we're looking at were done by the enslaved people that he brought to Washington. So when we look around the National Mall, we tend to deify the people who thought it up, and not the people whose blood, sweat, and tears went into actually making it. And most of those were enslaved Africans. And actually acknowledging the people who were there, the people who did the work, would be so wonderful, because for too long, their contributions have been ignored. Being able to have their name spoken in the middle of the things they created. They might not have thought it up, but they created it. It was their blood, sweat, and tears that made it actually exist for us to see today. would be an honor that that has been long overdue. And it's so great to even hear people talk about this today. Because believe it or not, 20 years ago, no one wanted to talk about the contributions of African American slaves in Washington. It was almost like a forbidden subject. But now, I think as we as Americans have evolved more, we're able to actually look back into the past and give the acknowledgement and the honor to all facets of American history, not just the parts that make the perfect, beautiful stories that we hear in school books.
I think that was what the impetus was for the performance that opened up Light of Freedom on the Mall last fall, was in response to the actions of January 6th, and thinking about how there have always been liberation struggles in this country, or like the Black and Indigenous liberation struggles are ongoing. They've never ended, right? In the way that they've been fought from the margins to the center. And those are the things that, you know, I think Martin Luther King says in his last speech that, you know, we just want you to be true to what you said on paper, right? It's like, those are the people who are testing the limits of the written word, or of what these like proclamations or these ideals are, right? They're the ones that are constantly taking it to task, taking it and putting it in the fire and seeing actually what is true, what's not, and trying to, you know, rid this nation of its original impurities and imperfections, right? That were embedded within like this kind of like the structural overview of how things function. But yeah, I don't remember what my point was. I lost it somewhere in there.
but I'll
yes.
just jump in here, Abigail, and say it wasn't African Americans who said all men are created equal.
Right, exactly.
They said it.
And they said it.
Now we want you to live up to it.
Yeah,
It wasn't us that came up with the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
You came up with it. Now the question is, do you believe it? So a lot of what we see with these struggles for civil rights, for human rights, for equal rights, all people are saying is that when we came up with this country, you were the one who said all men were created equal. You were the one that said we have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Do you believe it, or was it something that you were just saying at the time? All these struggles are trying to do is to get us to that more perfect union that, once again, we didn't come up with, we didn't make up.
Yeah,
we just want you to acknowledge and live up to the words you came up with. And which always surprises me when there's such backlash when people ask for the rights that everybody else has. I mean, once again, it's not like any of our ancestors came up with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All men are created equal. They came up with it. Now we should live up to it.
And so I remember now that the pictures are up. Thank you, Amy. Was that it was all in response, or it took inspiration from the Stono Rebellion, and thinking about, you know, people actually liberating themselves, like versus like, you know, the story from the Longfellow poem that school children were taught like a century ago about Paul Revere's Ride, or the ways in which we're like taught these mythologies about the greatness of the Revolutionary War or the Boston Tea Party and things like that. There's actually people who were like strong arm liberating themselves from their oppressors. That was much more than taxation without representation, or people being pissed about a Stamps Act or whatever else, you know, that they felt was unfair in terms of their obligation and responsibilities, and not being treated as with the rights that they were guaranteed by the British government. But anyway, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have more questions. I'm sure I do. Anne.
Well, I mean, I want to make sure that if anyone has any last ideas or thoughts that they'd like to share for the sake of this conversation. I mean, I've just been enjoying listening to you both and appreciating what it is to hear from two people whose work is embedded in history as raw material, and then who take that raw material and use it in such distinct and different ways to take our ideals and hold them up to the light and hold us accountable for them, and to them, and acknowledge all these, and sort of insist on our acknowledging on the National Mall and in this DC history that we're told, all of the stories that have not been given their due. And it's an honor to listen to you both speak, and I'm thrilled that we were able to convene the dialogue today. But I do want to make sure, if either of y'all have last words to share, that we give you some time to do so.
No, I'll just conclude by saying, just the idea of these lost and forgotten Americans finally being honored on the National Mall, like we did with the soldiers of World War II, World War I, the Korean War. Just the idea of them finally being acknowledged, and the work and the suffering they went through here in Washington will be very powerful, and a way, I hope, in reconciling some of the wrongs that were done to them in the past, by at least having their names finally spoken out loud in the capital of the most powerful country in the world. They are the foundation of who we are. Even though their names may have been lost to history, bringing them back will be another way that we as Americans acknowledge our past as we move forward into the future of that more perfect union that we keep talking about.
Yeah, I can't say nothing after that.
That's where we end it.